Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. In this episode, we're joined by Daniel White, who is a registered nutritionist, functional medicine and circadian health coach, founder of Sleep Better, Live Better, and chairman of the Sleep Better, Live Better Foundation. Be prepared to learn what circadian biology is and why it matters, what chronotypes are, and the role that they play in understanding circadian biology and our circadian rhythm, how we can change our chronotype by changing our environment, why circadian rhythm disruptors disrupt our health and lead to chronic disease, how to balance ancestral wisdom with modern day living, and so much more. Before that though, this episode is brought to you by Riverside. Riverside is an online studio platform designed to record, edit, and share high-quality podcasts built for growth from day one. It's the platform that I love and use here to produce Raising Consciousness episodes. Powered by AI, you can record in 4K video or from your phone and automatically remove filler words such as ums, as, you knows, and many other speech patterns. Built for human conversations, Riverside makes it super easy to start a podcast that sounds great. Ready to start your podcast? Check out the link in the show note description to learn more about Riverside and get a 15% discount off a paid subscription. Now let's dive into today's episode with Daniel White. Daniel, welcome to Raising Consciousness. How are you doing today?
Luke, thank you so much for allowing me to be here, my friend. I'm well. It's that transitionary period into the autumn for those of us in the UK. And today there was a bit of sunshine, so it always helps to enliven one's soul.
Sunshine? No, it's been, I think the phrase is pissing it down with rain here. So no sunshine here.
Two slightly different ends of the UK. Hopefully it'll be sunny for you tomorrow.
Yeah, hopefully. Fingers crossed. First question. What do you do and why does your work matter?
Brilliant question. Thank you, Luke. So what do I do? I'll try and give you the TLDR, the too long didn't read it, because I could probably talk about this for 20 minutes. I now head up an organization and a charity who are on a mission to change the way that people fundamentally appreciate our relationship with nature and how our body's circadian biology operates, which are these 24-hour kind of body clock mechanisms that influence almost all aspects of our health and our well-being. It's relatively contemporary, new information, although it's as old as time itself in many respects. It's quite new to the medical literature, especially in more recent years, and it's still really not part of the zeitgeist for everyday people. And as a result, there's probably like 99% of the population that are walking around who have no idea what I'm talking about. But there are so many low-hanging fruit, so many gems, so many insights, so many simple practices surrounding this idea of our circadian biology that can have a phenomenal impact on the health of our communities, our societies, our families, our friends, and ourselves. So we're on a mission to do that. I have essentially been doing that to a degree for the last 7 or so years, initially through another charity that I ran where we performed some research. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk a bit more about that, the impact of circadian biology on sleep in adolescents in schools in my home island of Guernsey. And prior to that, for the last 10 to 15 years, I've been working as a nutritionist, functional medicine trained health coach in the larger sphere of kind of like health and well-being, nutrition, sleep, all of these kind of separate aspects. And then to answer the second part of that question, I suppose, why is it important? We're at a time in human history where we have unprecedented levels of many chronic and acute illnesses, everything from obesity to diabetes to neurodegeneration to neurological challenges, heart disease, the big cancer is on the rise higher than ever before. And post-COVID, I think it can be argued that there is greater pressure on our physical and mental health services, everything from hospitals to clinics, than there has ever been at any time in human history. And so what we're trying to do here is, I suppose, we're trying to reach for the low-hanging fruit in terms of educating people about the importance of simple lifestyle actions that they can take under their own control to empower themselves to avoid a lot of these chronic symptoms that people, are experiencing on a societal level, and also to kind of unlock that innate ability to thrive as human beings, to contribute towards our societies and to live, a life as we say, in rhythm with nature, which has so many benefits. So is it important? Yeah, I believe, it's fundamentally some of the most important work I've ever done in my life. And I believe that in the years to come, we're talking the next 12 months, the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, a real shift in paradigm towards an understanding of some of the things we'll talk about today, I believe is going to cause a fundamental, complete change in how we approach medicine and how we approach health.
And what's your personal why? Like, why do you do what you do?
Yeah, thanks for that question as well. So I'm 31 years old now. I'm a fairly healthy guy. I'm running multiple businesses. I like to train. My cognitive capacity is pretty high these days. It wasn't always that way for me, though. From the age of about 13 to around 17, I was probably one of the unhealthiest children that I know, as a result of addictions to technology use, lots of video gaming, terrible diet, lack of exercise, shut myself away in my room playing computer games. And you've got to imagine that, 17 years ago when I first started doing that, there was no, tablets, there was very few computers, it was dial-up broadband on your Dell home desktop. There isn't a lot of, the apps and the smartphones and the devices and the consoles and things that there is this day and age. So about 17 years ago, I was probably the only child I knew who was suffering addictions and contraindications as a result of emerging technology, right? Completely addicted. You fast forward these 17 years and I do a lot of work in schools with a lot of adolescents. And essentially there's millions of me walking around depressed, anxious. There's points in my teenage years where I was suicidal, very overweight, had a lot of problems, allergies, autoimmune issues. And so personally for me, throughout my career, I have come to the position of learning that I'm here to give back, and I'm here really to serve those people that I once was, and to stop them from experiencing a lot of the challenges that I had to circumnavigate, in my early adult life, that made me far less than I could have been, at that age.
And final question before we dive into circadian biology, I'm really fascinated to obviously discuss that today, is behind the work, who is Daniel White?
That's a really good question. Let me think about how to answer this. Now, let me tune into my heart and to let it flow. I'm somebody who I think has an appreciation for many different circumstances that people find themselves in life. I always remember that when I was young, my grandmother, who sadly is no longer with us now, she said to me, Daniel, I'll teach you to dine with paupers and to eat with kings. And so throughout my life, as a young adult and as an adult, I've gotten up to all sorts of mischief. And doing so has allowed me to really be human and to be able to relate to people from all different kinds of walks of life. So these days, I'm very focused on my health and well-being. I pretty much, prioritize that above most other things. But throughout my life, there were points where I was addicted to gaming. There was points where I was addicted to drugs. There was points where I was overweight. There's points where I was lean and shredded. There was points where I was at university. There's points where I was unemployed. I feel like I've experienced a very large gamut that has kind of led me now to this place where I don't take anything in life too seriously. And I think it's important that as human beings, in the pursuit for progress, whether that's progress like we're trying to make in terms of, our challenges and our campaigns and improving people's health, or progress in terms of your own health and well-being, I think it's very important. And this is what I've learned in the last 10 years and has led me to become who I am now, is that you don't lose touch with, the things that you care about deep down. So who is Daniel White now? Daniel White is the head of an organization who's very passionate about changing the world. Daniel White's also a father. Daniel White's also a video gamer. Daniel White's also a DJ. Daniel White's also someone who loves people. And he's also someone who likes to not talk to anybody for some days of the week. I guess I'm quite a malleable person, and I've always considered myself to have a broad range of interests and the ability to pivot when appropriate between the relationships that I hold.
Circadian biology, quantum biology. What are we talking about when we talk about these things? Are they different? Are they the same? This is where your work is rooted, reading through what you do. So let's let's dive into it.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So I think let's talk about circadian biology first, because I think it's a bit of an easier concept for people to appreciate. So circadian biology, also termed chronobiology in the literature. It's just, these are Latin words, right? So let's unpick these words a little bit so people understand. Chrono means time, so chronobiology, time biology, the biology of time. Circadian rhythms, circadian biology. The word circadian we can split up into circa, which comes from the Latin, means approximately, and then diem, which means a day. So when we talk about circadian biology, we talk about the biology that spans the rhythm of a day. And when we talk about the rhythm of circadian health, we're talking about the same thing. So as long as we've existed on planet Earth, and as long as life itself has existed, and as long as the planet has been spinning on its axis, which, you know, some people will tell you is 7 or 8 billion years, other people will tell you is a lot longer. That's not my job. That's the job of the physicists and the astronauts and, you know, people in that sphere. But as long as we've existed and as long as life has existed, we've been experiencing these periods of 24-hour transition. It's not exactly 24 hours, right? And that's why we have, you know, leap days and leap years and all these sorts of things. But primarily, the Earth rotates on an about 24-hour axis. And as a result of that, depending where you are in the world, close to the equator, you get very kind of equal amount of light and dark every day. These light and dark cycles, you go, you know, to the northern hemisphere, up into Scandinavia, and certain times of the year, it's pretty much bright all the time. Other times of the year, it's pretty much dark all the time. And so all life on Earth, depending on when you live in the planet, has evolved to adapt to this natural 24-hour rhythm of light and dark. Okay, so it's the environment, the light and the dark in the environment, as well as other factors such as temperature. So the temperature of the environment, which obviously changes a lot from the equator to the North Pole, for example. These different environmental factors have influenced and governed our biology as a species, but also the biology of every species, you know, plant, animal, insect, bird, bee, everything else. So when we talk about circadian rhythms and we talk about circadian biology, we talk about the processes that our cells, our systems, our organs go under as a result of how our biology interacts with these 24-hour rhythmic periods. So for the vast majority of the time that we've existed as a species on planet Earth, 99.999% of that time, we lived out in nature. And so we were exposed to periods of light and dark that were very predictable. It altered slightly across seasons and whatnot. Very predictable temperatures and all of these sorts of things. And then you fast forward to especially the last 150 or so years, and we have, as a species, begun to take control of our environment, the light in our environment, the temperature in our environment, at which times of the day we see bright light, at which times of the day things are dark. We've become an indoor species, so we've moved out of our natural environment, whereas 150 years ago we probably spent 95% of our time outdoors, sowing the land, working on the land. Human beings were sort of agriculturalists, right? And now, because of the technological revolution and the industrial revolution, we spend all of our time indoors. And so there's been a growing awareness of circadian biology for the last probably 20 or 30 years, but only really so in the last 10 years especially. And I believe that the Nobel Prize in 2017 was given to a group of researchers who were able to pinpoint some of the molecular mechanisms of these circadian rhythms in our cells and how it influences the human body. And so now there's this huge growth and explosion in research, which is looking at how, in layman's terms, our departure from those environments in which we lived, where the cues from the environment, such as the light and the temperature and those sorts of things, influenced our biology, how that has now changed that we are indoor creatures living surrounded by technology, surrounded by artificial light, and where we now control the environment in terms of the night and dark cycle, so the light and dark cycle, I should say, and the temperature. So within all of the cells of our body, cells make up, organs, make up systems. There are these what we call clock genes, okay, which tell our cells how to interact, when to repair, when to unwind, when to rejuvenate, when to carry out other functions. And those genes are turned on and off by the environment. So circadian biology is really the study of how the timing mechanism within those cells, within the genes, within the genetic clocks is influenced by factors in our lifestyle.
I think as you alluded to in the beginning, most people still don't, they're just like completely blind to this, right? I think a growing number of people, or maybe just the circles I surround myself in, probably understand or have heard circadian rhythm more than circadian biology, and chronotypes probably more than circadian rhythm. So, what do most people misunderstand about circadian rhythm? And actually, is circadian rhythm the same as circadian biology?
So really, really good questions, and thank you for asking them, because it helps us to, translate layman's terms for the listener. So circadian rhythms is really circadian biology, but circadian biology is the study of circadian rhythms. Okay. So when we talk about circadian rhythms, we're talking about the rhythms within the cells and within the body. And really, the most obvious outward manifestation of the circadian rhythm is our sleep and our wake cycle. So when people think about the body clock, they think about when we go to bed, when we wake up. And then you alluded to this idea of chronotype, so it being our time type. Now, there's a lot of academic research that's been conducted over the last 50 years that has looked at the population, studied large groups of people, and has tried to ascertain, what is it that dictates when we wake up and when we go to bed? Is it personal preference? Is it genetic factors? Is it our environment? And so people have been subdivided into these types, or you may know, or you may have done a test that will tell you that you're a certain type, or you may just naturally believe you're, an early morning type, a morning lark, as they call it, or a night owl. And what's really interesting, I think, about a lot of that research is that when we talk about circadian rhythm research in the modern day, what we're doing is we're studying a modern environment. Okay. So if you had tried to look at a human being 150 years ago, you most likely would have seen somebody living in a village who had access to candles and maybe a little bit of firelight in the evenings, maybe some oil lamps. And what you would have seen at that time in society is that the vast majority of people lived on a very consistent rhythm where they woke up around the time of sunrise and they probably went to bed 2 or 3 hours maximum after the time the sun had set. And that's because the light that they had available, the firelight, the lamps, these sorts of things, they were very expensive to run. And so people weren't artificially illuminating their environment into the evenings. And so chronobiology research back then might have told you that, there was pretty much, not a lot of differentiation between the chronotypes or the time types that people have. But then you go forward 150 years to present day, and what we see is a mass explosion in lighting, especially, cool white LED lights, which are pretty standard now in your bathroom, your kitchen, your bedroom, in your apartment block, out on the streets. They're lighting up, walkways, pathways, roads, motorways, headlights on cars. Then you go into your house and you have mobile phones and laptops and tablets and televisions. Within schools, within offices, within hospitals, you have this very standardized type of lighting. And so it's a kind of a miracle in a way that we have harnessed electricity and that we're now able to dictate when it's light and when it's dark. But if you were to study chronobiology now, as they do, and compare that to 150 years ago, we see this, mass proliferation of different chronotypes. People who like to go to bed very early and wake up very early. Other people who like to go to bed very late, very, very late. There's almost this, they used to say it was early morning and night owl. And now I think they've, in some research studies, subdivided it into like 5 categories: the very early morning person, the early morning people, the standard, the late people, the very late people. And there's been a lot of arguments that, this is built into our DNA and our genetics. But interestingly, now we're beginning to understand that actually a lot of it could be to do with our lifestyle preferences. So when we like to socialize, when we like to entertain ourselves, how we like to entertain ourselves, is it with technology late at night? Do we live in an environment where there's a lot of bright light exposure, which we can talk more about how that bright light, and especially LED light from all of these devices, confuses the body clock and would lead us to stay awake later into the night. So I think for the average person who's found out what their chronotype is, that can be quite useful in relation to the fact that, okay, I understand that, I fit into this subsection of people, and maybe understanding that helps me to appreciate why I don't get up that early in the morning, or why my brain works better in the evening, or why I'm more energized in the afternoon than I am, before lunchtime. but it doesn't do a lot to necessarily help people understand how to change that if they want to. Because ultimately, a lot of that tendency towards a later chronotype and to staying awake later and to having poorer sleep quality and more fatigue, which links, hand in hand with this mass explosion in all of these what we call non-communicable diseases in terms of the obesities, the diabetes, the cancers, the metabolic problems, the neurological problems. What we see is this trend towards increasingly brighter light at homes, less darkness at night, less exposure as human beings to darkness, and then these later and later chronotypes. So I think, the scientific community is been racking its brain for a long time trying to really understand this topic. And I think it's kind of now coming full circle to basically shining a light in our face, excuse the pun, as we appreciate more about circadian rhythms and how different factors, which I'm happy to discuss, things like light exposure being the master factor, but also the timing of our foods, the timing of our exercise, the stress that we experience, the temperature in the environment, how all of these things, which differ between each person within the home and the environment in which they live, how those actually control the time in our cells, which dictates not only when we go to bed and when we wake up, but also billions of other processes that are happening below a conscious level.
Before we move there, because I do have some questions around that, and this is something that as I've become more health conscious, have researched and dug a lot into myself, and that's really fascinated by it. On the topic of chronotypes, do you think that chronotypes, there's enough scientific evidence to say that actually chronotypes is a real thing? If that makes sense, because some people, some sectors might say it's not true, or whatever it is, and just kind of thinking back to when I guess wasn't as health conscious as I am now. I've never been a person who would stay up late. All my friends in my teenage years would be out to 10:30 at night. And I want to go home at 8:30. And I had no knowledge about this. It's only been in the last couple of years. I used to wake up much earlier than I have the best friend who didn't used to wake up to 11 a.m. right, and I was awake at 7:30, 8, right. So it's been since I've kind of discovered this and more on the chronotype side and getting my chrono test done to see. I think some tests link you with an animal, right? That also have a similar kind of cycle to you. And then kind of seen that actually I am more of a morning person, and then I've kind of that's raised awareness actually during the day and when I prefer to do things and everything. So I just want to validate the chronotype thing, because I have seen some sectors that have dispel it a bit and use it as a reason for people to stay up late at night, because they're a night owl, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and thank you for sharing your personal example as well, because it helps me to illustrate it as I move forward. So I think the question is about usefulness, right? We have to ask, how useful are these definitions? If a definition of someone being a late type is because you have a family and one of those family works in an organization and they have young children, and so the only time that mother and that father get to spend together is at the end of the day when the kids have gone to bed, and so they don't want to go to bed at 8 p.m., when they might have otherwise done before they had children, before they rearranged their whole life, so it was basically in the evening, when they had their leisure time. So in the circumstances where, you find out that you're a late chronotype and you can have a conversation with your boss in the office, and the boss says, oh, okay, well, maybe you want to start to come in a little bit later in the mornings. You can start work at 10 because you don't go to bed until 12 and you're not up until 8, and, you get a little bit of time in with your children. That's useful, right? That can help someone to make adjustments to their lifestyle that ultimately serves them, it serves their organization. But if that same person was to think, well, I'm just a night owl and that's the way it's always going to be, and I can never change that, then that's very unhelpful. Okay, that can be very disempowering. So quite often what I see about chronotype research is that people don't explain that your chronotype is a result of many factors, environmental and biological, although the environment is impacting the biology, so it's all the same in many senses. But in your example, in your case, when you were younger, for whatever reason, you preferred to wake up earlier. Now, maybe that was like, as you grew up, your family tended to get you up early. It was just a thing. Maybe your family were also early types. Maybe you went out in the morning for a walk, or you went to the park, or you did whatever. And over a long time period, it became ingrained into your routines that, I wake up and do stuff in the morning. I get up early and do stuff. And so that act of getting up early and doing stuff, those things that you're doing, probably going outdoors, doing some movement, doing some exercise, having some breakfast, whatever that you're doing a lot earlier than your peers, is conditioning you to be an earlier chronotype. Okay. So it's not that you couldn't be a late night person. I'm sure that if you force yourself to stay awake later and later over a course of weeks, if you expose yourself to lots of light, if you ate very late at night, you would probably start to wake up later and later in the morning, because you would need to get more sleep, because that's what happens when you stay awake later, is that to make up that sleep quota, you need to sleep in a little bit longer. But if your friends were all, blocking blue light at night, maybe, using filters on their mobile phone screens or laptops, or they're wearing themselves a pair of blue light blocking glasses, or you might see in the background of my environment right now, there's a red light bulb on, and they were having, their dinner earlier, and they were coming home and they were relaxing and winding down at 8 p.m. when you did. Chances are that over a period of time, their chronobiology would begin to shift to an earlier rhythm. But ultimately, what we have in society is like this situation where people aren't advised about how to shift their chronotype. So that, in my opinion, is extremely unhelpful, because what we know is that a later chronotype is associated with greater chance of metabolic health problems, obesity, diabetes, depression, anxiety, and such like that. But all we're doing currently is saying, oh yeah, you're that, and you're more likely to get that. We're not necessarily giving the people the tools to help them to understand why they are either of those types and how they might shift that if they need to.
So that's really interesting, because I was under the illusion that a huge part of our chronotype is like embedded in us, and that it might shift in like teenage years, and then as we enter later kind of stages of life as well, and as we grow older. But for the most part, like, our chronotype is what it is. But it sounds like actually our chronotype can change and is more impacted, maybe on some levels, by the environment.
Yeah, so it's fluid. And I'll use a couple of good examples to illustrate this. There was a study that was done in Boulder, Colorado, a couple of decades ago, by a guy called Kenneth Wright. And he took people out into the wilderness, right, camping. He did this at two different times. He did it in the summer and he did it in the winter. Now, in Boulder and Colorado, in the summer, there was about, I believe, 14, 15 hours of daylight, therefore 9, 10 hours of darkness. And then in the winter, it kind of shifted, right? So more like 15, 16 hours of darkness, maybe like 8 hours of daylight. Now, he took these people out in the summer, as I said, and in the winter. When he took them in the summer, this was a group of people, by the way, who had completely, separate chronotypes across the board. Some were early morning people, some were late people, etc. When he took them into the wilderness and he took away all technology and all artificial light, and they only had candlelight and firelight, and they lived in tents for a week, all of them shifted onto the same chronotype. In the summer, all of them fell asleep earlier than at home, and they woke up earlier than at home, and they all felt better rested. They all produced melatonin, which is a key marker of the circadian rhythm. It's a hormone. It's not a sleep hormone, but it's a hormone which is released in large amounts by the pineal gland in the brain in response to darkness. So they all began to produce this hormone earlier, which led them to winding down earlier, getting to sleep earlier. And then in the winter, they took the same people back, and what they found is they actually slept longer in the winter. They all fell asleep earlier than at home. They didn't wake up earlier than at home. They just slept for longer. So that's really interesting in terms of when we lived in the wilderness, when we lived in the wild, would we have slept the same amount of time in the summer as the winter? Probably not, right? Because there was more darkness. But the most interesting thing for me about that study is that all of those subtypes of chronotypes, they all kind of orchestrate to the same clock. And that's similar to other research that they've seen. And again, this is, different context entirely. This is closer to the equator. You look at the Hadza, which is a tribe in Africa. They all fall asleep 2-3 hours after sunset. They all wake up just before sunrise, like clockwork. If they're young, they're old, children may sleep a little bit longer. Some people, certainly as they age, may sleep a little bit less. But I think it's really, really interesting to understand that, what's the context? What's the change there? Well, no technology, no mobile phones, smartphones, social media, laptops, all of this sort of stuff, keeping people entertained, and no bright light which offsets the circadian rhythm, especially certain types of light, blue light in particular, which is within these LEDs, which are in all of our modern lighting and technology. And then when you look at how our culture evolves, okay, compare it when I was a kid, to now, kids. And when I was a kid, we didn't have iPads, laptops, tablets, all of this sort of stuff. So I was sent to bed at 7 p.m., throughout my childhood years. And then when I turned 13, I got myself a computer and I got myself a mobile phone. And so I started to engage with the world differently, socially. So my social structures changed. And I think that happens for children. It did 15 years ago, it probably did 30 years ago. It does now, right? So we have this explosion in like FOMO and not wanting to miss out on, whatever our friends are doing. So we stay awake later, we entertain ourselves, we start to watch more TV series, we have more autonomy over our choices. And it's particularly interesting how that seems to coincide perfectly with this shift towards a later chronotype. So there is a lot of research saying that, and I don't believe this to be, not true, is that, younger children tend to wake up earlier, and then as you become a teenager, you shift towards a later chronotype. That's very well established in the literature. But then again, we have to consider that the literature is studying present day people living in these environmental circumstances. So would it be the same in a tribe in Africa? Would all of their teenagers, shift to a later, like a late evening kind of chronotype? I don't know. It kind of begs the question, right? But it's interesting how our societies are set up to make us, consume more entertainment, consume more technology, consume more light, as and younger these days, right? Kids younger and younger get mobile phones, laptops, tablets, social media. And so I'd be really interested, this is an experiment that I can personally do, but really interested to see how that impacts, younger children's circadian rhythms.
What's the connection or the link between our circadian rhythm and our health?
Yeah, really, really good question. I'm going to use like a variety of layman's terms here. So we have these clock genes inside our cells, very, very complex topic, right? We have this idea now in the last couple of decades that we are not just the results of the genes that we inherit from our parents and our ancestors, but actually our environment or things outside of the genome itself influence how our genes express themselves, whether they express themselves towards health or whether they express themselves towards disease. Be surprised if anybody listening to this doesn't know that if you eat unhealthy processed food, you gain weight. Okay, because the unhealthy processed foods, all the toxins and the empty sugars and the empty calories and the seed oils, they express information on our genes, which causes them to, express basically unhealthy options as these proteins in our genes unfold. Now, the circadian rhythm and the light-dark cycles control that epigenetic, that's what we call it, epigenetics, which means above the gene, so things outside of our actual genome itself that influence our genes. So light and our circadian rhythms are a factor which control the ability of our DNA to express itself for either health or disease. The same as many things, including stress, exercise, nutrition, diet, all of that sort of stuff. When we talk about circadian rhythms in particular, one thing that is really important to understand is that we have these 24-hour rhythmic flow of different hormones. Two of our master circadian hormones, one of them I've mentioned before, is melatonin. Now, melatonin is a very powerful antioxidant. It's an anti-cancer hormone. It helps us to regulate the immune system. And so every evening, our brain begins to release large amounts of melatonin from the pineal gland in response to darkness. Okay. So here's the thing to understand. If our circadian rhythm is disrupted because of light exposure or because of other factors, and we produce less melatonin, there is less repair, recovery, and rejuvenation happening on a cellular level. And if there's less of that repair and rejuvenation going on because we produce less of the hormone melatonin that causes it, then we see increased rates of aging in our cells. So we biologically age faster. If our rhythms are disrupted, we can also have a negative impact on another hormone, which is called cortisol. So cortisol gets a bit of a bad rep as a quote-unquote stress hormone. Everyone says, I need less cortisol in my life. Cortisol's making me fat, ugly, sick, all these sorts of things. Cortisol is a very important hormone, helps us to increase energy, helps us to support our immune system, helps us to feel energized and alert, focused, vibrant. Now, cortisol levels should naturally increase just before dawn, peaking in about the middle of the day, and then bottoming out into the evening when melatonin comes into play. But if we're highly stressed, having a lot of caffeine, bad food, we've got a lot of psychological stress going on, we've got a lot of artificial light in our environment in the daytime and especially in the evening after the sun's supposed to set, then this can mean that this 24-hour dance, if you like, between melatonin in the evening, cortisol in the daytime, it gets disrupted. So what happens is we can't get out of bed in the morning. We don't feel energized and alert and alive. We need caffeine to get through the day. Or maybe in the evening, we feel like tired, but wired. So it's like we get home from work and we're super exhausted and we could just go to bed, and then we start to watch some Netflix or surf the internet, and then we get this like second wave of energy, right? So this is another way in which circadian disruption can really negatively impact our ability to get good quality rest and to feel energized and alert and alive at the right times of day. But fundamentally, what we know is when it comes to CRD or circadian rhythm disruption, there are like short-term impacts and then there are long-term impacts. So in the short term, if you're disrupted, you might find it difficult to focus, concentrate, you might have low energy, low libido, you might feel a bit stressed, you might feel tired, you might feel a bit snappy. But as this goes on for decades and decades, which a lot of people experience unknowingly because they have no idea that the light in their environment influences them, or the time that they eat their meals, or the time that they spend outdoors under natural light, they have no idea that all of these factors in the environment influence these rhythms. And so decades and decades later, that dysfunction on a cellular level every day and those processes that aren't healing and repairing and rejuvenating the cells properly result in the breakdown of tissues, the breakdown of systems, and then the manifestation of chronic disease. So when we see things like, and I'm not saying by any means that circadian rhythms are the only factor influencing these diseases, they're certainly not, it's multifactorial. But when we get to like cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia, chronic long-term heart problems, immune system regulation problems, autoimmunity, diabetes, obesity, that's like you were probably circadian disrupted years or decades before it got to that point. Because our circadian rhythms every day influence our fat burning, our metabolism, they influence our thyroid, which regulates our energy expenditure and output. It regulates our digestive system, how our pancreas, our liver, our gallbladder influence processes of digestion, metabolism, fat storage, and all of these sorts of things. So when our circadian rhythms are out of sync, in the short term, we feel crappy. In the long term, we can develop a lot of chronic disease.
What are some of the biggest disruptors of our circadian rhythm, and how do we navigate them in the modern world?
Yeah, this is really great. And this is a great opportunity for me to talk a little bit. I won't go into too much depth, but talk about the challenges associated with circadian rhythm disruption, right? Number one is that nobody knows they've got it, right? So you might be listening to this for the first time thinking, fucking hell, I feel a bit tired some days, or, I'm gaining weight a bit, or, I'm finding it difficult to focus. Maybe I'm circadian disrupted. Okay, so that's like number one is the awareness, the bubble, the eyes open, the jaws drop. Wow, okay, need to do something about this. And then it's there like, well, where do I go for good resources and support and guidance and things like that? And so these are the challenges that I experienced on my journey to, circadian enlightenment, you might call it, over the last decade. And as a result now, the team that I'm working with, we're launching this thing called the Circadian Rhythm Disruption Challenge, which is like a little 21-day bite-sized learning journey where we teach people about the baseline, simplest circadian habits and the simplest things that we can do to bring ourselves back into rhythm. And let me talk a little about what those are. So the factors that influence our circadian rhythm and the timing of our rhythms are known in the medical literature as Zeitgebers. What on earth does that mean? It's a German word which means time givers. So the major time givers, the environmental factors that control the timing of the clocks in those cells. The first one, the most major, the master Zeitgeber is light. So you've got to imagine that for the majority of the time that we existed as a species, we lived outdoors 24/7. There was no behind windows, there was no behind glass, there was no LEDs, no mobile phones, laptops, smartphones, no lights in your fridge when you open it in the middle of the night, no lights in the bathroom, all of this sort of stuff. So we experienced completely predictable periods of light and dark. Daylight, darkness, daylight, darkness, daylight, darkness for millions of years. Then we invent firelight. Firelight is very different to modern lights. So firelight is quite warm. So if you've ever sat around a campfire or, lit a candle, it doesn't keep you awake, right? It's very warm, very relaxing. The biggest problem has been in the last 150 years, where we've developed increasingly brighter and brighter and brighter and more energy efficiency lighting. So number one toxic environmental stimulus for our circadian rhythms right now in the modern world is LED lighting. Essentially, the majority of LED lighting, not all, but the majority of LED lighting is what we call cool white. So it produces a white light, and it can be a little bit like what we call warmer. So a little bit kind of more of a yellowy kind of light, or it can be a very strict, white light. The problem is when you expose yourself to that type of light, especially in the later half of the day and especially after sunset, it directly tells your body to produce cortisol, which is the daytime hormone, and suppress melatonin. So if there was one thing that you could do to improve your circadian rhythm and you did nothing else, it would be to make your environment darker in the evening. Now, how might you do that? There's a variety of tools that we use. One of the big things we're keen on educating people about, just because they're very easy in the modern day, are these things called blue light blocking glasses. So it's where you get a pair of glasses that have an amber or red lens on them, and they can block the blue light from hitting the eye. I love seeing your pair. So the problem is that our circadian rhythm is set by the light that enters in the eye. The eye is not just a device that's created to see things, color and images and form, but it also has cells in it, special photoreceptors that actually tell the time based on the light and the type of light that enters the eye. So throughout the daytime, we go outdoors, we get lots of natural light that tunes our circadian rhythm in. And then in the evening, we'd have to do everything that we can to block, reduce, and filter the types of light that nature didn't design us to see at night, which is primarily blue light. So maybe we can stick a little something in the show notes. We've got a couple of little guides and things like that, ways that you can filter the light coming from your smartphones, your tablets, your laptops, your computers. There are programs that can do that these days. And there are these blue light blocking glasses, as well as other types of lighting, like different types of bulbs that you could install in your house in the evening that don't contain that type of blue light that is very stimulating for the system, because it is what is contained within sunlight and is what caused us to wake up and feel energized in the daytime. We don't want that type of light at night. Another major thing is the time at which we eat. So you have to understand that throughout our evolutionary history, there was no eating after the sunset. It's difficult to hunt and catch and gather and fish and cook. So when it got dark outside, that was not only a time for our brains to rest and release a lot of melatonin, it was also a time for our digestive systems to rest. So a lot of people right now are eating very late at night. They're watching a lot of programs, entertaining themselves, working late under these bright artificial lights. So some of the simplest things that we teach in this challenge, and the things that I teach my clients every day are, making the environment darker, removing the blue light, eating dinner earlier, getting a lot of daylight. There are some other things as well. So the temperature of your home in the evening should get a little bit cooler in the bedroom at night, and that helps to kind of represent what would have been happening out in nature as our body's core temperature lowers, which is a stimulus for us to get deeper sleep. Also the movement. So, moving a lot in the morning, getting outdoors, going for a walk, getting natural light in your eyes, performing your activity and your exercise as close to the daylight hours as possible, not working out in, gyms with lots of LED lighting late at night and wondering why you can't get to sleep and you can't wind down in the evenings, because all of that movement, that heat, that stress, which is a good form of stress in the body, really is designed for daytime in terms of, our ancestral environment and how we evolved. And then also, I would say the activities that you do. So like use of technology, whether you're, doing really stimulating stuff before bedtime. Like I said, I'm big into gaming. I enjoy, gaming once, twice, 3 times a week. I don't do it until 11 o'clock at night. I do it for an hour or 2 or 3 after work. I'll block the light from the consoles or the television. I come off, an hour or 2 before bed. I read a book. I wind down, spend time with my family, those sorts of things. So it's really developing changes to the way that we live our lives that better appreciate the environment in which we live, how that changes across the seasons, and honoring that aspect of our evolutionary biology, which says that in order to really have a well-functioning body clock, we need to be acting in a way that is in accordance with what's happening outside in the natural world.
We'll get back to talking to Daniel White in just a moment, but before we do, I would like to mention OxyShield. OxyShield is one of the leading brands when it comes to blue light blocking technology. They're medically approved, FDA and MHRA rated screen protectors and blue light blocking glasses filter out harmful blue light to protect our eyes, skin, and help us to sleep better. I personally love their blue light filter for Mac and iPhone and make them my first step when it comes to investing in blue light blocking products. You can try out OcuShield for yourself by using the link in the show note description and make Zoom fatigue, eye strain, dry eyes, and sleep disruption a thing of the past. Now, let's get back to today's episode. How important is it for us to do the same things at the same times during the day, if possible, like more often than not? So, for example, wake time, sleep time, time we exercise, time we do eat our meals, etc. And does over time, like, our body learn that? And I guess what's the benefits of that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So, yes, consistency is the key to healthy circadian rhythms. So, if tonight I wore my blue light blocking glasses and I went and read a book at 7 p.m., I might be asleep by 9. If tomorrow I stayed up and watched an episode or 10 episodes or something on Netflix with all the lights on in the house, that's going to cause confusion. It's like the equivalent of changing time zones. One day I'm telling my body clock this is happening. Another day I'm completely creating a different environment. So if we want to improve our circadian rhythms, improve our health, improve our energy, improve our vitality, improve our sleep, recovery, rest, we need to be consistent with these habits. Having said that, we live in this modern world, and so it's important for people to understand that if you get things wrong occasionally, it doesn't mean that you should never, do the good habits in the first place. Good example, one thing that I often experience with clients is they say to me, well, when should I eat my meals? Now, after improving my circadian health and really focusing on my light environment and when I go to bed and when I, train, which is usually in the afternoon for me, I exercise. And I get that that's not possible for everybody, especially if you're working a 9 to 5, it can be quite challenging. A lot of people will say to me, well, I'm not hungry when I wake up in the morning. I'm not hungry to eat breakfast when I get up in the morning. So I skip breakfast. And then I end up, eating lunchtime and then maybe in the afternoon, and then I have a late dinner. How am I going to change that? I'm just not hungry. And people need to understand that, like, our hunger signaling and the hormones that control that, things like leptin and ghrelin, they are programmed by our circadian rhythms. So really the best place for us to start being consistent, the most important place for us to start if we want our body to move into a natural rhythm, is in the evening, looking at our behaviors and especially our light environment. If we can consistently make things darker, if we can consistently block and filter blue light at night, and if we can consistently have an earlier dinner meal over a period of a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we should see a very large shift. We need to try and keep consistency with those behaviors if we want to continue on that path. There have been many times in my life where I've fallen off the wagon, in the earlier part of my adulthood when all of this health and well-being stuff was quite new to me. I'd be on a diet for a few weeks, I'd have good sleep for a few weeks, and then I'd be back on late nights and, infinite video gaming and boozing at the weekends and all those sorts of things that I did, when I was a young adult, kind of navigating our culture. Now that I'm a bit older, now that I've practiced this stuff more consistently, I can probably have one evening where I stay out a little bit later or, go out and DJ or do something like that. And it doesn't cause me huge issues, but I need to be practicing these quite frankly simple circadian principles at least 80 or 90% of the time. And when I say like simple, I get that people don't think of them as simple. And the large reason that is because it's usually going against social norms. A lot of people don't know about this stuff yet. And so, your family aren't really understanding, or they don't get why you want to filter the lights or turn them off or, go to bed early. And so what we're doing with the CRD challenge is, we're trying to create this community of people that can support each other to make changes that maybe your family and your friends and your colleagues and, those people you love, maybe they don't quite get them yet. And maybe, society isn't quite ready to embrace these evolutionary principles at large, that we can create these micro communities within the world that can support people to make changes.
And I think from my personal experience, that's one of the biggest challenges, is the people that you spend the most time with, and I guess society at large, because it's like societal beliefs. But like, for example, with light, I still do live at home, and so I'm like, gotta change the light bulbs, like get red light bulbs and stuff. And they're like, this thinks I'm crazy, right? Although I have converted some of my family to the blue light blocking glasses, which is obviously good. But yeah, I think that in a way is one of the biggest challenges, not just within what we're talking about here with our circadian rhythm, but also within health in general. Whether that's encouraging people to move and get their steps up or whatever it is. I want to go back to one of the questions I said in terms of like, does our body learn kind of like when we do things at like consistent times? Because so this was like a little bit of maybe a case study within the summer. So within the summer, my daily routine was a little bit different, and I was noticing that I was more, maybe a bit embarrassing, but a bit more so like constipated and stuff, because I changed my routine. So like my whole kind of system was out of whack. But then as soon as I got back into like my quote unquote normal routine or a more consistent routine over the period of all of August, most of September, I noticed that process, I guess it would be like the digestion process within the body, like completely went back to normal. So is this something that people maybe one thing that people don't understand is that actually our circadian rhythm does control processes within the body like that, and that actually if they are facing symptoms and issues like that, it could be their circadian rhythm and their daily routine. And once they find like their routine, I call it your flow, then you'll start to see an improvement with some of these issues, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And circadian health touches every system of the body. Gut motility, for example, it's very well known in circadian research that if somebody has a healthy circadian rhythm, regular digestion, regular trips to the toilet is part of how our digestive system processes. At the same time, our stomach, our gallbladder, our liver, our kidney, our pancreas, they produce and excrete the digestive enzymes and stomach acid and things like that far more effectively during the daytime, right? So if you shift over to eating later and later at night, and you're awake later and later at night and your circadian rhythm's confused, it would absolutely make sense that things like energy levels are off, digestion is off, the time that you go into the toilet is off, maybe there's like stomach acid issues, maybe there's a bit of reflux that people get when they eat very late at night, and people they think that this is something maybe they've inherited or something that's genetic, or maybe it's the food that they're eating, but it might not even be those things. It might be the timing of those things. So your example points really clearly to, and I've had it myself, right? I've had periods in my life where I've been under stress and duress, and, I've sunk myself into like video games a little bit, or I've, escaped on Netflix and found myself having later and later nights. And then all of a sudden, like, I don't want to wake up so early, or I'm feeling tired, or I'm not going, having my regular toilet trip first thing in the morning, or, I'm not able to be focused and alert for that meeting at 9 a.m. like I usually would be. And it is, it's a good opportunity then to notice that something is awry and something has changed. And then obviously to have that sort of self-experiment where you shift things back in. But the problem is, you and I are clearly self-experimenters, right? We're clearly conscious people who are aware of and are intuitively understanding how our body works, or at least noticing these patterns of functioning. A lot of people have been so deconditioned to this idea of being their own, doctor, or being their own observer, or being their own experimenter, that they are disempowered because they believe that fundamentally we've inherited symptoms, or that symptoms, just because something is common, doesn't mean that it's normal. So when I work with people, and this is like the whole reason, going back to this social norms thing, and the whole reason that we created this movement around what's called the CRD challenge, or the Circadian Rhythm Disruption Challenge, is because in order for like a mass adoption of this understanding and a mass change for people in society, and basically societies across the globe, right? There has to be a tipping point at which more and more people on board and understand this education that pushes in the direction of institutions, public health, education, etc., taking stuff more seriously, and it becoming kind of more adopted by mass across the world. But the problem is, like you said, when you live in the social norms that making these changes more difficult, it's harder for that mass adoptive process to occur, which is why, thankfully now we have like this global community of people who can be sharing about their experiences, the changes in their symptoms, staying accountable by sharing, like what's happening in their lives, which of the recommendations we're making they're taking on board, and the shifts that are happening, and all of these sorts of stuff. So it's so true, and one of the reasons that I struggled to change a lot of my behavior over the years is that I was just surrounding myself with people who were, acting in ways that weren't necessarily in alignment, like with my highest aspiration for myself. Now, I still hang out with friends who don't really take their circadian rhythms that seriously. Maybe I don't hang out with them in the evening when they're more likely to lead me astray. So I think another really powerful thing is that once you've had that period, and the reason that we did the CRD challenge for 3 weeks is that, that 3 week period of changing and being consistent with some of these habits can be a phenomenal insight that actually causes you to reevaluate, who you spend your time with, what you spend your time doing, and gives you an experience. As a guy called Rick Rubin said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So once you spend a couple of weeks improving your circadian rhythms, you might have a lot more motivation and drive not to go back to behaving in the ways that you did before.
Yeah, it's interesting there because like sometimes I feel like I want to unlearn everything I know because like would it just be easier? But then it's like actually like the whole point of becoming more conscious and aware of these things is actually to better yourself, right? To live a healthier life. And although sometimes you face that resistance and that challenge, like in a way, like that's part of the journey. But yeah, I definitely sometimes feel that. One final thing I did want to touch upon was kind of a little bit of an insight that I had that I want to basically run by you. Do you think that sometimes people find this a challenge because, especially when we refer to and it's the same within nutrition actually, when we refer to like what humans did 10,000 years ago, and like people, for me anyway, I kind of see like people can't wrap their heads around that because we live in a different time, and so like why are we comparing to what we used to do because we don't live in that time? And it kind of highlights to me that actually our biology hasn't caught up with the modern world that we live in, and so we're still running on a lot of the old let's call them systems, for one of a better word, systems that keep us alive, right? That make us human, and that. So it's to be conscious of that, to be mindful of that, and to adapt to the modern world. If that makes sense, that's kind of one insight that I see, like why people might find it a challenge because we don't live in caves now, right? Like we do have the ability to turn lights on, and so for me, it just highlights again that and point that actually our biology hasn't caught up.
Yeah, like they say, we're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. It's true, and I think, whilst it's important that we appreciate the modern world and everything that the modern world can bring, when it comes to our health in particular, when it comes to like socializing, when it comes to our psychological health, when it comes to our physical health, we have to appreciate that, we're living on epigenetic and biological processes and systems that were designed for a very different world that we now live in. So, why are we all anxious and stressed and, experience ADHD and neurodiversity issues? Could it be because of all the inputs in society, the lights, the technology, the social structures, all being very different to, even go back a couple of 100 years when we lived in tribes, essentially modern tribes, right? Communities, villages, where we had more meaning, we had more purpose, there was less instant gratification, entertainment, scrolling, hits of dopamine. There was more natural, seasonal whole foods. The light and the dark cycles were, a lot more regular. We spent a lot more time outdoors, earth, grounded. We probably had closer, better developed relationships, not so much online interaction. And the question is, how do you feel about that? Because for a really long time, I think I used to ideate or like dream of living as a caveman. And then I thought to myself, well, that's not really, number one, accessible. And number two, it comes with lots of downsides, right? You get fall over, you break your leg, you might die. You might not be able to keep up with the tribe, or you have a harsh winter and you might also, die of starvation, or you get bitten by a lion or a tiger and you're screwed because there's no modern healthcare. I think it's important to honor those ancestral tenets and those ancestral principles if we want to be able to thrive as a human being in the modern world. And then it's kind of like, both sides of the coin. We appreciate the ways that our biological organisms underpinned by evolution, and we can take advantage of, all the modern tools, the social medias, the technology, entertainment, that we have in the modern world. So it's that it's that delicate line, because if you stray too far in the modern world and you disconnect from those ancestral tenets, then disease is essentially the result, because you're not giving your body and your cells the input that they need to thrive. So, if we can do anything through this conversation, Luke, I guess it's encouraging people to think a little bit more about some of these topics, especially these topics that so vastly impact our circadian rhythms, because that's so fundamental to our health and our well-being. But yeah, I agree with you, and it's something that I've pondered a lot over the years.
Daniel, thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure you'll be, I would definitely like to invite you back on in the future to continue to have these topics and discussions and conversations, discuss these topics, I should say. Where do people go if they want to sign up for the CRD challenge, learn more about your work and everything that you've got going on?
Really, really good question. So I'm personally on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook as Daniel White or Daniel White Health. And then the CRD challenge, it's at the CRD challenge on Instagram and Facebook, or thecrdchallenge.com is the website. So we launch on the 20th of October, 2024. It will be an evergreen process though. So even if you come and join up to the challenge after that, you will still get the same experience. You just won't start on the launch day when we're launching with everyone else. As I said, it's a bite-sized 21-day journey, little by little, pre-recorded educational materials, recommendations, support of a community, and that anybody who wants to learn, like the 411, the basic foundational tenets of circadian rhythms and how to begin to improve their health and well-being from that perspective, more than welcome to come and join. And I hope that I'll see you there as part of it, Luke.
Well, thank you for your time today. Very important topics that we've covered today. And I look forward to continue to have these conversations with you in the future. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Luke.
I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast with Daniel White, where we've been learning about and exploring circadian biology and why it matters. The main lesson that I've taken away from my conversation with Daniel today is that we can change our chronotype by changing our environment. As I mentioned in the episode, I used to think, basically because I got taught that our chronotype is fixed and only really changes throughout teenage years and as we grow older into midlife and beyond. However, that's not the case. What did you learn and what are you taking away from this episode? And what positive changes are you going to make as a result? I would love to hear them. So feel free to leave a comment or review below this episode, wherever you're watching, whether that's on YouTube, listening to the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. I read every comment and review and appreciate you tuning in. I look forward to seeing you, talking to you in the next episode. See you then.